So, Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, just forced her own broadcast licensing office to hand back a document one of its own officers tried to quietly rewrite. And the part that I genuinely can't stop thinking about isn't the radio cameo itself. It's the 9 days nobody was supposed to notice. Back in July, Sophie recorded a small cameo for BBC Radio 4's The Archers. One afternoon, one studio, one signature on a single-page clearance form. A clearance form, which is simply the document that officially authorizes how and where a recording can be broadcast. Nothing about that afternoon looked like a story. Sources describe her arriving early, reading the short script twice in the corridor, laughing once with a sound engineer about how strange it felt to say someone else's words for a change. She signed the form on a clipboard, handed it back, and left the building by 4:30. The form went into a filing cabinet at the Royal Household's Broadcast and Media Licensing Office, and everyone assumed that was the end of it. It wasn't, because sitting inside that same file, added after her signature had already dried, was a clause Sophie never approved. A clause that quietly handed one man ongoing control over how her voice and her cameo could be used, resold, and repackaged indefinitely without her needing to sign anything ever again. His name is Martin Vale, and by the time anyone noticed what he had done, he was already trying to keep the file locked inside his own office. If you're new here on Throne Files, hit subscribe so you don't miss any updates on this story, because what happens to Vale by the end of this is exactly the kind of ending this channel exists to show you. Here's the thing about a licensing office. Nobody thinks about it until something goes wrong. Its entire job is boring on purpose: clearance forms, signatures, dates, filing cabinets that never get photographed. Martin Vale had worked there for years, a senior clearance officer, the kind of title that sounds procedural and draws almost no scrutiny from anyone above him. Sophie, on the other hand, is the keeper of something people forget matters. Every royal broadcast appearance runs through a signed release, and that release exists to protect exactly one person, the royal who signed it. She holds the right to say when, where, and how her cameo gets used again, resold again, repackaged into something she never agreed to. That's the boundary. That's what the form exists to guard. Vale wanted more than his job description allowed him. Sources describe him as a man tired of how invisible his office's work was: clearance paperwork, filing work nobody ever thanked him for, while broadcasters quietly profited from reused royal footage year after year. So he built himself a shortcut, not a loud one, a clause, 4 sentences long, buried in flat legal language, granting extended reuse rights that funneled every future licensing request through him personally, forever, without needing Sophie's signature again. Two sides. One holds the boundary, one wants what's sitting on the other side of it. Vale had not always wanted a shortcut. Colleagues who trained alongside him a decade ago described someone genuinely good at the work, patient with paperwork nobody else wanted to touch, the kind of officer who caught small errors before they became large ones. What changed, reportedly, was watching a broadcaster's production assistant, half his age, negotiate a six-figure reuse deal for footage his own office had cleared for a nominal fee. He kept a printout of that deal in his desk drawer for months, the way some people keep a receipt they can't stop rereading. By the time he drafted his clause, he had convinced himself he was correcting an old unfairness, not creating a new one. Now look, this isn't the first time a royal broadcast release quietly grew wider than the person who signed it ever agreed to. Nearly a decade ago, a different royal documentary clearance was expanded the same way, reportedly discovered only after the footage had already been resold twice over to two separate production companies. By the time anyone caught it, there was nothing left to reclaim. No correction, no consequence, just a quiet note buried in a file nobody read again, and a lesson nobody in the office had actually learned from. Helena Cross, Sophie's private secretary, remembers that case. She had been junior staff when it happened, and it stayed with her, the way one small office can quietly rewrite what a signature meant and nobody notices until the thing itself is already gone, already sold, already unreachable. So when she opened Sophie's Archer's file this autumn and read 4 sentences that didn't match her own memory of the clearance meeting, she didn't wait a week to act on it. She flagged it that same afternoon, in writing with a date on it, because an undated concern is just a rumor with better manners. That's not a coincidence. That's not caution. That's a woman who watched this exact pattern get away with itself once and decided it was not happening a second time on her watch. Sophie's reaction, the way it has been described since, wasn't fury. It was quieter than that. She read the clause twice at her desk, cream paper under her thumb, lamp low, curtains half open to a grey afternoon, and said almost nothing for a full minute. Then she asked Cross one question. Who else has this happened to? Not what happens to me now. Who else? That's the detail that tells you who she is. 61 years old, married into this institution for more than 2 decades, and her first instinct wasn't self-protection. It was checking the door for everyone standing behind her. Cross did the obvious thing first. She requested the original file, the version filed the day of the recording, pulled for direct comparison against the copy currently sitting in the licensing office's active drawer. The request went to Martin Vale himself because clearance requests always went to Martin Vale. He said the file was under review. He said it needed a supervisor's signature before it could be released. He said, essentially, wait. Cross didn't wait quietly. She logged the request in writing with a date and a time stamped on it the same afternoon she found the clause. Because if a decade of institutional memory had taught her anything, it was that undocumented requests have a way of disappearing. Vale, for his part, moved the physical file out of the shared archive shelving and into a locked drawer inside his own office, the kind with a brass key he kept on a chain in his pocket, not hung on the office board where every other clearance key sat in plain sight for anyone to check out. That single move, one key, one drawer, one supervisor's signature that somehow never arrived, turned the paperwork question into something else entirely. Because honestly, you don't lock a document away in your own pocket if you have nothing inside it worth hiding. That's the moment this stopped being administrative. That's the moment it became a fight. Sophie was told about the locked drawer within the day. Reportedly, her response was short. Bring in the trustees, not lawyers, not the press office. The trustees are an independent panel that reviews every disputed licensing decision the office makes, which is essentially the household's own internal check against exactly this kind of overreach built precisely, so no single officer could ever quietly hold a document hostage from the person who signed it. It's a safeguard almost nobody outside the household even knows exists, created after that old documentary case nearly a decade back, when nobody had the standing authority to demand a file returned before it vanished for good. Vale's countermove came fast. He produced an older clearance form, unrelated, 6 years old, from a completely different production, and told the trustees liaison that the missing approval question Cross had raised was actually about that older form, not the current one. A procedural excuse, dressed up as clarification, designed to buy time and blur exactly which document anyone was even discussing. It didn't work, but it wasn't built to work outright. It was built to slow things down just long enough for Vale to quietly amend the file back towards something closer to what Sophie had originally signed, and erase the 9-day gap before anyone thought to check a single timestamp against it. That's where Grace Milton comes in. She's the archivist who logs every file movement inside the licensing office, a job so unglamorous most staff don't even know her name on site. But every drawer, every checkout, every hour a document leaves its shelf gets recorded in her ledger in her own handwriting, whether Martin Vale liked that fact or not. Cross found Milton in the archive that same week, between the shelving, a desk lamp buzzing faintly overhead, and asked her a single question. Has this file left the building in the last 3 months? Milton didn't answer from memory. She pulled the ledger down, ran one finger along a column of dates, and stopped. Cross remembers watching her go quiet, the way people go quiet when a piece of paper says something a conversation never could. Cross brought Milton in as a formal witness, and that single decision changed everything about the shape of this dispute. What had been a private query between one private secretary and one clearance officer became a documented 3-person matter with a paper trail. Nobody could quietly walk back afterward. Vale still refused to open the locked drawer in front of them. He said the supervisor's signature still hadn't come through. He said it again the next day, and he said it again the day after that, standing in his own doorway, arms folded, the brass key visible on the chain at his belt the entire time. What most coverage of this story got wrong or simply missed is that Vale was, by this point, stalling against his own colleagues, not against Sophie directly. He had not seen her in person once through any of this. He was betting, quietly, that a private secretary and an archivist would eventually tire of the fight before a duchess ever became personally involved in a filing dispute. I was wrong. During the same week, Cross and Milton were building their paper trail. Vale reportedly placed a call from his office phone to a production contact at an independent broadcaster, asking, in general terms, how quickly a reuse license could be converted into a paid arrangement once his review of the file was complete. He did not mention Sophie by name. He didn't need to. The contact later told colleagues the call felt less like a courtesy update and more like a man quietly testing whether his shortcut still had value, even with people already asking questions about it. To be fair to Vale, for one moment, broadcasters do sometimes ask licensing officers to pre-clear reuse language in advance to save time later in a production cycle, and a generous reading of his clause, might have called it efficiency rather than theft. That generous reading lasted exactly as long as it took Grace Milton to find the date stamped in her own ledger. Milton's ledger held the answer the entire time. She simply had to pull the right page. Every checkout in that office gets stamped with a date and an initial, and when she went back through the log for the week after Sophie's Archer's signing, she found it. Vale had checked the file out for 4 hours, alone, 9 days after the recording session, 3 days before it was formally filed as closed. 4 hours, alone, 9 days later. That's not an edit window. That's not an oversight. That's a rewrite window. And Vale's own initials were sitting right beside it in Milton's handwriting. Cross took the ledger page straight to the trustees, not to Vale. That's the shift, the exact moment this stopped being an internal office matter and became something the institution itself had to answer for. The trustees opened a formal review that same week. The stakes changed domain entirely. This was no longer a disagreement between two members of staff. It was an independent licensing authority deciding whether one of its own officers had exceeded what his position had ever allowed him to do. Vale was informed a review was opening. Sources describe him as calm about it, even confident, telling colleagues over tea that the paperwork would sort itself out once people understood the full context behind the clause. Privately, though, he reportedly asked a junior colleague to quietly check whether the trustees had ever actually removed anyone before, and didn't like the answer he got. He still had the file, he still had the key on the chain at his belt. And as far as he was concerned, possession of the drawer still meant possession of the argument. I did not yet know about the ledger page. That evening, at home, Sophie reportedly told her husband Edward the shape of what had happened. A clause, a drawer, a locked office, and he asked her the same question he has apparently asked her at every difficult turn across more than 2 decades of quiet royal service. What do you actually want to happen to him? Not what does the process allow. What do you want? She told him she wanted the file back clean, and she wanted the desk that had held it hostage to be empty by the end of it. Edward reportedly said only, then make sure the ledger page never leaves your hand. The reversal came inside the licensing office itself on a grey morning with the trustees present, Cross present, Milton present, and the ledger page laid flat on the desk between all of them. Sophie arrived in person. That detail alone changed the temperature of the room because Vale had spent weeks betting she never would. He straightened his jacket when she walked in. Nobody had told him she was coming. She did not raise her voice. She read Vale's own clause aloud, sentence by sentence, in the flat, clear voice of someone who has read a great many documents in her life and recognizes exactly which sentence is doing the damage. Then she placed the ledger page beside it, tapped the date once with one finger, and asked him to explain a signature dated 9 days after a meeting that had never approved a single word of it. Vale reached for the older 6-year-old form again, the same procedural excuse he had used on Cross weeks earlier. It did not survive contact with the ledger a second time. One of the trustees, a quiet man who had said almost nothing until that point, simply turned the ledger page around to face Vale directly and asked him to read his own initials out loud. He did not read them out loud. He said nothing at all. That silence is the moment the room's balance of power actually shifted, not the ledger page itself, which had been sitting in Milton's cabinet for weeks already. But the second Vale had nothing left to say in front of the one person he had never expected to see standing there. The trustees did not need a long deliberation after that. They revoked his signing authority on the spot, verbally, with Sophie and 2 witnesses present to hear it stated plainly. That's not a warning, that's not a review pending further evidence, that's a removal. Cross stood near the back of the room, through all of it, close enough to the wall to feel it at her shoulder blades, and reportedly thought of the old documentary case for the first time in years, the one that never got corrected, the one that taught her undocumented requests disappeared. This time nothing disappeared. This time there was a ledger page with a date on it, a witness who logged it, and a duchess willing to stand in the room and ask the question out loud. That's the difference a decade makes when somebody finally decides to write things down. The price landed fast after that, and it landed on Vale directly, nobody else. He surrendered the brass key at the desk in front of the same people who had watched him refuse to hand it over for weeks. He was walked out of the licensing office without the file, without the drawer, without a single future clearance request ever routing through him again. No key, no file, no office. His name came off the door plate within the hour and off the internal staff directory by the end of the week. The title that had sounded procedural and drawn no scrutiny for years now drew all of it all at once, and none of it in his favor. Colleagues who had worked beside him for years were reportedly told only that his clearance authority had been withdrawn following a trustee's review, nothing more specific than that. A formal letter went into his personnel file the same afternoon. noting the revoked signing authority as permanent, not under appeal. His reference for any future clearance or licensing role, the kind of role his entire career had been built toward, now carries that letter attached to it, whether anyone ever asked to see the file or not. This is not a story about a man losing a job. It's smaller than that and worse than that. He lost the one thing his entire quiet shortcut depended on, the assumption that nobody senior enough would ever personally check his work. That assumption is gone permanently for him and for whoever eventually replaces him at that desk. Here's the scene people are going to keep sharing from this one. Picture the desk. Vale's desk, licensing office, mid-morning, ordinary fluorescent light. The brass key sits in a small tray on the desk where it now belongs, next to every other office key no longer hidden on a chain in anyone's pocket. The drawer that held the file for weeks stands open and empty because the file itself has already gone back into shared archive custody, sealed, corrected, and logged under 2 signatures instead of 1 from now on. And the chair behind that desk is empty too because nobody has been assigned to it yet. Cross walked past it on her way out of the building and reportedly didn't say a single word. She didn't need to. The empty chair said it for her. A cameo, not a career, and Vale never had the right to either. Charles, reportedly, was briefed on the whole affair once the trustees' decision was final and chose to say nothing publicly about it at all. No statement, no comment through the press office. Some might have expected him to intervene, to smooth it over quietly, the way the institution sometimes prefers to handle staff embarrassments, protecting the officer's reputation over the individual's accountability. That expectation didn't land. He let the trustees' decision stand exactly as they made it, in public record terms, without softening a single line of it. That's the reversal nobody saw coming. Not a rescue, not a quiet rescue, not a quiet reassignment, just silence that let the punishment stay exactly as hard as it already was. Word of the removal moved through the wider household faster than any official memo could have. 2 other clearance officers, reportedly unconnected to Vale's file entirely, quietly asked Milton to double-check releases they had personally processed over the past few years, just to be certain nothing similar was sitting inside them unnoticed. Nothing was found, but the fact that people checked at all without being asked to is its own kind of consequence, the kind that doesn't show up in a press release but changes how an entire office behaves going forward. The licensing office, in the weeks after, quietly changed its own internal rule. Every broadcast clearance form now requires 2 signatures before it can be filed as closed, not 1. Nobody announced that change publicly. It simply became how the office works now, a small procedural correction that exists because one officer, once, decided a single signature was room enough to build something for himself inside. The signed Archer's cameo release itself, the object this entire story keeps returning to, is back exactly where it should always have been. In Sophie's name, in locked archive custody, available to her, and no one else the moment she asks for it again. The file remembers everything. That's the part Vale never planned for. He assumed a signature was the end of a story. It was only ever the beginning of a record, and the record outlasted him. Her rewrote her release, the archive rewrote his career, a cameo lasted an afternoon, his authority lasted 9 days too many, and every one of those days is written down somewhere he can no longer reach. Nobody at the licensing office talks about Vale much now. His replacement, a woman transferred over from the household's separate archive division, reportedly spent her first morning reading through the entire 2-signature policy twice before she signed anything at all.